Why does German in anime always sound so weird? Whether it be in songs or character names, it just doesn't sound like real German. And while most of it is usually intelligible, sometimes it ends up being complete gibberish. In this video, I want to explore why that is the case. We'll first discuss the Japanese sound inventory and then look at some restrictions for sound combinations in Japanese. Just to be clear, these are not the only things making up Japanized German, but they're a big part of it. And because I don't want to bore you with dry theory only, we're also going to have a look at some of the character names of my favorite anime, Frieren, and analyze exactly what is happening with those names. Okay, let us first have a look at the Japanese sound inventory. The sound inventory of a language is essentially made up of all the sounds that natively appear in that language and that help distinguish words from one another. These sounds are called phonemes and are always language specific. For example, when we take the words sin and sing in English, the only difference is the final consonant. By just changing the n into an n, we change the meaning of the entire word. In English, n and n are therefore phonemes and can be considered part of the English sound inventory. However, because phonemes are language specific, just because n and n are separate phonemes in the English sound inventory, doesn't mean that this applies to other languages as well. If we look at Japanese, for example, we can see that a sound like n exists in words like pan, for example. But saying pan versus pan doesn't change the meaning the same way as it does for sin versus sing. You might get a few funny looks saying pan because the underlying sound is supposed to be n, but it doesn't fundamentally change the meaning of the word. N is therefore a phoneme in the Japanese sound inventory, whereas n is not. Now that we have a better understanding of what a sound inventory is, let's have a look at the specifics of the Japanese sound inventory. The first thing we can see is that it is really small. When we compare the Japanese sound inventory to that of other languages, like German, English, or Korean, we see that with only 5 vowels and roughly 14 consonants, it has only half the sounds that English and German have, and about 10 fewer sounds than Korean. This becomes especially apparent in a side-by-side comparison of the German and Japanese vowel chart. But why does this matter? The many vowels in German can all make a difference in meaning, so I can't just swap one vowel with another thinking that everything will stay exactly the same. When adapting German words into Japanese, all of these different vowels now have to be mapped onto the 5 available vowels in Japanese. This naturally leads to accented German. If you say bitte instead of bitte, these are 2 different words in German, because I and I are 2 distinct phonemes in the German sound inventory. In Japanese, however, there is no way to express this distinction because both of these vowels are just represented by the same phoneme in the Japanese sound inventory. Obviously, this does not only go for the vowels, but for the consonants as well. Even though there is a solid overlap between German and Japanese, some notably missing consonants are f and v, as in Phase and Vase, and the lack of distinction between R and L. Since we can't just, leave out the sound and completely change up the word, it is thus necessary to replicate the German sound within the restraints of the Japanese sound inventory. As I already explained, sometimes mixing up sounds or not getting the exact sound right can cause misunderstandings. That alone, however, is more often than not just perceived as accented German. Like when a Japanese person is trying to learn German, for example. You can tell they're Japanese because of their accent, the way they're pronouncing things. At the same time, you can also tell that they're definitely speaking German though. When German names or lyrics are transferred into Japanese, however, not only do the sounds change, but also, and maybe even more importantly, something happens to the syllables. Because the way syllables are structured in German versus how they're structured in Japanese is fairly different. That is why sometimes some character names can be completely unintelligible. Phonotactics refers to how consonant and vowels can be arranged within a syllable, essentially the rules that govern the structure of a syllable in a given language. In general, regardless of the language, syllables can be separated into 3 parts: the onset, the nucleus, and the coda, which are just the technical terms for beginning, core, and end. The nucleus is in most cases a vowel and is also the only obligatory part of a syllable. The onset and the coda are optional and are usually filled with consonants or just left empty. In linguistics, we use this notation to indicate the structure of a syllable, where C indicates a consonant and V indicates a vowel. If we look at the word phonotactics, we can separate it into the following syllables: pho, no, tac, tix. Remember, this is about the sounds of the word, not the letters, which is why the first syllable, pho, is just one consonant and one vowel, because even though it is written ph, it makes just one f sound. As we can see from this example, there's already quite a variety of arrangements with consonants in the onset and the coda. I'm going to spare you the full list of rules that there are in English, but it is important to note that both in the onset and in the coda, there can be multiple consonants in English, as seen in words like spring, grunt, or strength. Let us now turn to Japanese and have a closer look at Japanese syllable rules. Compared to German and English, Japanese syllable rules are extremely restrictive. The onset cannot have more than one consonant, and the coda is, generally speaking, left empty, with the sole exception being the sound n. I know I said just a second ago to keep apart sounds and writing, but it is important to note that Japanese doesn't have an alphabet the way we traditionally think of it, where each letter more or less corresponds to one sound and you can combine them to make new syllables and words. Japanese uses a syllabary, where each character is either just a vowel or a consonant plus a vowel. There are no standalone consonants, and without those, it is obviously quite impossible to add a consonant to the coda of a word. I don't know which came first, the syllabary or the syllable rules, but it makes sense that they kind of go hand in hand now and restrict each other. Putting all of this together, the simplified permissible syllable structure for Japanese looks something like this, where C stands for a consonant, J indicates a palatalization, meaning a y sound, V is the vowel, and N is quite literally the sound n. The reality is a little more complex, but wouldn't really change much about the fact that it's still a lot more restrictive than English and German syllables. So some examples are nani, nan, nya. You may have already guessed it, but when we want to use German or English words in Japanese, we have to adapt those words to the Japanese syllable structure. That means we have to break apart any consonant clusters, and we also can't have any pesky consonants hanging out in the coda. Let us now have a look at some examples to see everything we've learned so far in practice. Some character names in the anime Frieren are actually pretty close to how they'd be pronounced in German.
Heiter, heiter.
Heiter.
Eisen, Eisen.
Eisen.
Sense.
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 Serie-sama. Serie.
Serie. For these names, there are slight differences, especially in the vowels, but I'd let them pass as just accented German. The second E in Eisen, for example, is not typically pronounced in normal speech, and even in careful enunciated speech, the vowel wouldn't be an E. We can observe a similar phenomenon in the last E in Sense and Serie, where the sound would typically be a reduced version of the sound called a schwa, so that it would be Sense and Serie. And then for Serie, as I already hinted at before, the Japanese R is very different to the German one, so that there is a slight deviation there as well. None of these examples had consonant clusters that couldn't be transferred to Japanese, so that it wasn't necessary to extensively switch things around and change things up. But let's have a look at some of the more complex names of the show. Our main character Frieren already has quite a few things going on, so let's have a look at them one by one. Starting with the sounds, Frieren has the same issue as Eisen, where the vowel of the last syllable in German isn't really pronounced, but because Japanese doesn't allow for that, they pronounce it as ren, making it thereby a fuller vowel than it is in German. The second interesting observation is the initial f sound, because if you listen very closely to the Japanese name,
Frieren. Frieren.
you'll hear that it actually does somewhat sound like an F. So how is this possible? Earlier in the video I said that there was no f in Japanese, but that was a bit of a simplification. There is one character in the syllabary that is pronounced as an F sound, and this character always has the vowel U. because remember there are no singular consonants in Japanese, they always come with a vowel. But wait a second, there's literally no U anywhere to be found in Frieren. So what happened here? This is where our phonotactic knowledge comes in handy, because when we look at the first syllable, Fri, we see that there is a consonant cluster. In German, FR is a perfectly acceptable consonant cluster, just like in English, free would be as well. For Japanese, however, this is not permitted, so to break it apart, we have to add a vowel. In this case, we add U, with the additional benefit of being able to produce the F in free. But O and I are also common vowels to break apart consonant clusters. And that's how we get from Frieren to
Frieren.
Another great example is our favorite elf monk, Kraft. If you paid attention in the previous example, you'd notice that there is an F stuck in a consonant cluster in the coda. So what do? We add a U sound in between the F and the T, resulting in Krafut. But remember, we can't have singular consonants in the coda of a syllable. So to separate the T, we add an O and turn it into Krafuto. Finally, obviously we do the same with the initial consonant cluster by adding a U sound again, which gives us
Kraft.
Notice how Kraft in German is a one-syllable word, but in Japanese it turned into a four-syllable word, because there were so many consonant clusters that needed to be taken care of. As a final, quite extreme but really good example for just how much of a change there can be, I want to bring up the character name Lügner.
Lügner.
Right off the bat, again, since there's no LR distinction in Japanese, we have to resort to using the Japanese R as a way of representing the German L. To represent the German Ü, they made use of the palatalization, which when combined with U gets pretty close to the right German sound. Finally, a really nice touch is that they interpreted the last syllable based on the sound of the German pronunciation, rather than how it is written, which would be something closer to neru. It is not uncommon for foreign words in Japanese to be transcribed the way they would be written in the foreign language rather than the way they would be pronounced. If you look at the word Berlin, for example, you can see that it was totally taken from the way it is written in German rather than how we pronounce it. Because in German we say Berlin. So in Japanese, if we went by sound, something like Bearin would be way more accurate than the way it is actually written, Berurin. Anyways, as a last comment on Lügner, we can see that the syllable structure again changed quite a bit. From this in German to this in Japanese. Remember that the J stands for a Y sound here. I think this is a great example of just how much pronunciation can change. And I would argue that an untrained ear could not recognize what Ryuguna originally meant. You made it to the end of the video, and I'll be honest, I got kind of lazy scripting a proper outro, but I think, or at least hope, that you learned enough in this video anyways. So let me know what you thought of the video, if you were able to follow along just well. I'd love to get some feedback, and as always, I'll see you in the next video.